The sun had long since dipped beneath the hills when Mark Dawson eased his tired body down onto a patch of dry earth. Coyote Bluffs, a scatter of leaning buildings and whispering winds, was the last stop before the land turned to nothing but rock and sky. Mark weren't much more than a whisper himself, a cowboy with calloused hands, a past buried under hard rides, and a future that looked no brighter than a desert night. He slept most nights behind Carson's livery stable, curled beside a fence post and an old bedroll that smelled of horsehair and rain. His daddy, Nathaniel Dawson, once ran cattle north of the bluff, till a storm took the herd and the bank took the land. Mark buried the man with his own hands under a lone cottonwood and hadn't spoken his name aloud since. That morning, Mark was patching a busted gate out at Garrison Creek Ranch when a stranger rode up, dark horse, coat heavy with dust, black gloves, silent as sin. Didn't say a word, just handed Mark a cream-colored envelope and turned right back down the trail. Mark stared at it long after the rider was gone. The paper smelled of lavender and gun oil. The note inside was short, penned in a sharp hand. Mr. Dawson. Supper. Blackthorn range tonight. Come clean. Come quiet. No signature. Didn't need one. Folks round Coyote County whispered the name, like it might burn their tongues. Eleanor Blackthorn. Cattle baroness. Widow with land big as a state, and a stare sharp enough to slice beef from bone. She hadn't stepped foot in town in 5 years, not since the fire that took her husband and half her house. Mark didn't have a clean shirt, but he borrowed one, brushed off his boots, tied back his hair. He rode west, toward the thorn-wrought gates of a house folks called a palace and a prison both. At the Blackthorn gates, a ranch hand nodded and said, "She's waitin'." The house rose like a fortress, columns thick as tree trunks, the doors carved with roses and rifles. Inside, it was colder than he figured. The dining hall stretched long and lean. At the end of that table, in a dark purple dress, sat Eleanor Blackthorn. She didn't stand, didn't smile. "Mark Dawson," she said. "Sit." He did. "You knew my husband," she said, her voice low but not unkind. "He owed debts. You were one of them." Mark shook his head. "He paid me with words, not coin. I worked a summer breaking horses. He said the check was in the post. It never was." Eleanor leaned forward. "And yet here you are." Mark nodded. "Your note said come quiet. I figured a man don't get that kind of invitation twice." The silence stretched. "I've got need of a man with no ties," she said finally. "A man with nothing to lose. There's land being stolen from me, fences cut, cattle shot. But the sheriff, he don't lift a finger. Says I've no proof." Mark sipped the coffee she poured, bitter, like her tone. "You want me to be your proof," he said. "I want someone who knows when to speak and when not to. Someone who'll ride for right, not reward." He studied her, the woman who'd buried a husband, ruled an empire, and now asked him to ride into fire on her behalf. "I reckon I'm that kind of fool," Mark said, setting down the cup. "What's the job?" "First," Eleanor said, "you'll come see the body." Mark stiffened. "You said cattle." "I said land," she answered. "And sometimes men are the worst pests of all." Outside, the wind howled across the dry hills, and Mark Dawson knew the trail ahead wouldn't be easy. But he was used to long rides and longer odds. What he didn't yet know was that this woman, carved from iron and fire, would burn her way into his soul before spring. The body lay in the old dry wash, half covered by wind-blown dirt and thorn brush. Mark knelt beside it, brushing away the dust with gloved fingers. Whoever he was, he hadn't gone easy. Bullet through the neck, another through the gut, and boot tracks all around, scuffed in the red clay like dancers that didn't know the steps. Eleanor stood a few paces back, arms folded tight, her dark veil fluttering in the wind. "He was one of mine," she said. "Name was Henry Callan. Good rider, better tracker. I sent him to follow a trail of cattle gone missing. He didn't come back." Mark rose slowly. "Who knew where you sent him?" "3 men," she said, her voice like flint. "My foreman, my steward, and my neighbor." Mark spat in the dust. "You got a snake in your own house." "I've got a rattler in my bedroll," she said, "and I want it smoked out." Back at the Blackthorn house, the foreman, a lanky fella named Deke Riley, met Mark with a nod and a sharp stare. "Didn't figure you for the house guest type," he said, eyeing Mark's saddle-worn boots. "Didn't figure myself for it neither," Mark replied. They passed the stables, where horses huffed in the cold air, steam rising from flared nostrils. Inside, the steward, Tom Bennett, polished a ledger by lamplight. Short, balding, glasses perched on his nose, he looked more banker than ranch hand. "Trouble?" Tom asked, not looking up. "Always," Eleanor said, sweeping past. That night, Mark ate at a corner of the table, while the house creaked with wind and secrets. Eleanor paced slow behind him. "You think you can find who did it?" she asked. Mark looked up. "Maybe. But it ain't about the prints in the dirt. It's about who's afraid enough to look over their shoulder when I come riding in." Eleanor's gaze narrowed. "You're not afraid?" "Ma'am," Mark said. "I've slept on snake nests and drunk from muddy boots. I'm too tired to be scared." Later, after the house went quiet, Mark sat alone on the porch, watching the moon rise over Coyote Bluffs. The stars stretched endless, and his breath fogged in the cold air. He thought about the boy he used to be, the one who believed a man could build something with his own hands and not have it burned down by debt or greed. He didn't hear Eleanor come up behind him. "You got someone waiting back in town?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "Just ghosts." She sat beside him, close but not touching. "I buried my husband with a bullet in his chest and a secret in his coat. Since then, every hand I hire either lies or leaves." Mark looked over. "And what makes you think I won't do the same?" Eleanor turned, her face pale in the moonlight. "Because you showed up." The silence between them thickened, not with romance, but with something harder. Trust not yet earned, pain not yet confessed. Below the porch, the wind kicked up again, and from the hills came a sound too sharp to be nature. A gunshot. Mark was on his feet before the echo faded. "That come from the lower pasture?" Eleanor nodded. "That's where the rest of the herd's penned." Mark grabbed his rifle. "Then it's time to ride." And just like that, the poor cowboy and the Baroness of Blackthorn were bound by more than a supper and a name. They were riding into blood and dust, where bullets answered questions and loyalty was worth more than gold. The lower pasture lay 3 miles south, down a narrow trail that twisted through dry creek beds and scattered juniper. Mark rode hard, Eleanor beside him, her dark coat whipping behind her like a shadow. The moon threw enough light to see by, but not enough to know friend from foe. When they reached the fence line, 2 steers were down, shot through the skull. A third was still twitching, a clean hole behind its ear. Mark slid from the saddle, crouching low near the carcasses. This wasn't no rustler too hungry to run. This was a message. Eleanor stood silent, her breath fogging in the cold. "To me." Mark looked up, his eyes like flint. "Or to whoever you sent to follow them. This is meant to say, don't come looking." From the trees came a low whistle. Not wind, not owl. Mark froze, reached slowly for his rifle. A figure stepped from the shadows, long coat, wide hat, rifle at ease. But the way he moved, smooth as creek water, Mark knew better than to relax. "Evening," the stranger drawled. Mark didn't lower the rifle. "Evening. You shoot these steers." The stranger chuckled. "If I had, reckon I'd be long gone, don't you think?" "Some folks stick around for the fire," Mark said. The man tipped his hat. "Name's Rhodes. I ride for Judge Hollis, east side of the county. Saw the smoke, came to look." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Hollis hasn't had cattle near here in 2 years." Rhodes shrugged. "Maybe he's fixin' to change that." Mark stepped forward. "You alone, Rhodes?" "Far as you know." Silence thickened like storm clouds. Then, from the ridge, another shadow moved. Just a flicker, but Mark caught it. "We're being watched," he said low. Eleanor nodded once, already mounting again. "Let's ride." They didn't run, not yet, but Mark kept his hand near the rifle the whole way back, and when they reached the Blackthorn porch, the air felt different, tight, like breath held too long. That night, he didn't sleep. Sat by the window with the rifle across his lap, boots on, waiting. At some point, Eleanor brought him coffee. Thick, black, bitter as regret. "You think they'll come?" she asked. Mark didn't answer right away. "If I was sending a message," he said, "I'd want to make sure it stuck." She sat on the edge of the windowsill, looking out. "I was 18 when I married Malcolm Blackthorn. He gave me land and a name and never a moment of peace." Mark looked over, surprised. "He beat you?" "Not with fists," she said. "With rules. With silence. With making me small." Mark said nothing. He understood that kind of pain, quiet, slow, the kind that don't leave bruises you can show. Eleanor turned to him. "You ever had someone take everything you were and bury it under what they needed you to be?" Mark's jaw tightened. "My daddy did. Then the bank did the rest." She nodded. "Then maybe you understand why I won't let him take this land too." He met her eyes. For the first time, she didn't look like a baroness. She looked like a woman standing in the ruins of every dream she ever dared to believe in. And Mark, well, he'd lived in ruin so long, he almost didn't notice when a new foundation started to form. Morning broke hard and cold over Blackthorn Range. The frost had crept across the windows, drawing spiderwebs of ice on the glass. Mark rose with the sun, his muscles stiff from a night of watching and waiting. He brewed coffee, stronger this time, and watched the steam curl like smoke from a distant fire. Out past the barn, ranch hands were already moving. Deke Riley barked orders, with the bite of a man who liked being obeyed. Mark watched him close. Deke moved like he was setting up defense more than mending fence. Nervous hands gave away more than words ever could. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed, face unreadable. "They're scared," she said. Mark nodded. "Fear makes a man dangerous. Or stupid." She looked at him sideways. "And you?" "I get quiet." Together they rode out to the fence line. The cuts were clean, same as before. Someone knew what they were doing. No jagged edges, just wire sliced like butter with a hot knife. Tracks told the rest of the story. 2 horses, shod, not local. "You reckon they're hired?" Eleanor asked. Mark crouched low, fingertip to the hoof print. "Maybe. Or maybe they think if they hit you hard enough, you'll pack up and leave." Eleanor laughed, sharp, bitter. "Let them try." That night, supper was a tense affair. Deke sat stiff at the table, eyes flicking to Mark every few seconds. Tom Bennett, the steward, picked at his stew like he'd lost his appetite 3 days ago. Eleanor said little. Mark said less. Afterward, in the barn, Mark found a second set of prints, smaller boots, someone walking out back after dark. He followed the trail to the edge of the old orchard, where the shadows moved wrong. A figure stepped out, small, lean, fast. Mark raised his rifle, but the voice stopped him. "Don't shoot." It was a girl, maybe 15, 16, wearing trousers and a coat 2 sizes too big. Freckles scattered like stars across her nose. She didn't look scared. "Who are you?" Mark asked. "Name's Sadie. I work the kitchen. Sometimes other places." Mark lowered the rifle. "You been sneaking out?" She nodded. "I saw him. The ones cutting your fence. I tried to tell the foreman. He said shut my mouth." Mark's jaw tightened. "What did you see?" Sadie looked past him toward the hills. 2 riders. One had a red scarf tied to his saddle horn. Same kind Judge Hollis wears when he comes to town. Mark exhaled slow. "You sure?" "I ain't blind," Sadie said. "But I ain't stupid neither. I ain't talking unless I know it'll matter." Mark studied her, the way her chin stayed up even when her hands shook. "It matters, and I believe you." He returned to the house, thoughts heavy. Eleanor was by the fire, arms wrapped tight around herself. "Judge Hollis," he said. "He's pushing. Try to force your hand. You got any leverage?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "He wants my land. Always has. But if I fall, he gets it all. There's only one way to stop him." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Which is, we take it to town. Make it public. Make it loud." Mark stared into the fire. "That's not your style." "No," she said. "But maybe it's time I stopped hiding behind veils and gates." Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the grass like a warning. And Mark knew this wasn't just about cattle anymore. This was about a woman reclaiming her power, a man finned in a cause, and a battle waiting to break loose in broad daylight. By the time they reached Coyote Bluffs, the sun had burned off the frost, but not the tension. Eleanor rode ahead, her back straight as an iron rod. Mark trailed her flank, eyes scanning every shadow. Folks paused as they passed. Some tip-tats, others just stared, wide-eyed at the sight of Eleanor Blackthorn riding into town for the first time in 5 years. The sheriff's office stood quiet at the edge of Main Street. Sheriff Egan leaned against the post out front, toothpick dangling from his lip, badge dull and worn. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "Didn't expect to see you, Miss Blackthorn." Eleanor dismounted. "I've got business." Mark stayed close, his boots crunching over gravel. They stepped inside. The place smelled of dust and sweat. Eleanor laid a folded paper on the sheriff's desk. "This is a sworn statement from one of my hands. Says Judge Hollis's men have been on my land, shooting cattle and threatening my riders." Egan glanced over it, scratched his beard. "That's so. You gonna act on it?" Mark asked, voice cool. The sheriff shrugged. "Ain't so simple. Judge Hollis is a powerful man. And if I started throwing powerful men through windows," Mark said, "you reckon that'd be simple?" Egan sighed. "Don't make this harder than it already is." Eleanor's eyes hardened. "If the law won't help, I'll make my own justice." The sheriff didn't answer, just looked away. Outside, the street had grown quiet. Word had spread. Judge Hollis arrived half an hour later, black carriage, red scarf, smug grin. He stepped down like he owned the dirt beneath his boots. "Eleanor," he said, "didn't expect to see you in daylight. Come to sell." "I came to warn," she said. "Get your men off my land." He chuckled. "Your land's worth more with me on it." Mark stepped forward. "You want to push this to a fight, Judge? 'Cause I promise you, I ain't the sort that misses." Hollis's gaze shifted. "Who's this?" "Hired gun. Man with nothing left to lose," Mark said. The townsfolk watched in silence. Every word fell heavy, like thunder rolling down the plain. Hollis smiled. "Well then, I guess we'll see who draws first." He tipped his hat and turned away, but his meaning was clear. This wasn't over. That night back at Blackthorn, Eleanor stood at the porch rail in, arms tight around herself. Mark joined her, rifle slung across his back. "He'll come," she said. Mark nodded. "He'll bring more than words next time." They stood in silence, side by side in the growing dark. Then Eleanor spoke, low and raw. "Why are you helping me?" Mark looked at her, something old and wounded in his eyes. "Because I spent half my life waiting for someone to throw me a rope. Now I got a chance to be that rope for someone else." She didn't answer, just reached out, her hand finned in his. And Mark Dawson, once just a poor cowboy sleeping behind a livery stable, felt something stir in his chest he hadn't known was still alive. Trouble came just before dawn. A rider galloped through the fog, hooves thundering down the trail toward Blackthorn Range like the sky itself was chasing him. Mark was already up, sharpening a blade by lantern light, when the pounding reached his ears. He stepped outside, rifle in hand. "Fire!" the rider gasped, reining in hard. "East barn's burning." Started fast. Too fast to be accident. Mark was on his horse before the man could finish. Eleanor was close behind, coat flaring like wings as she mounted. They reached the ridge just as the barn collapsed, a pillar of smoke curling into the gray morning sky. Flames still licked at the skeletal frame, horses neighing in panic from the nearby paddock. "Damn it all," Eleanor muttered, dismounting. She ran toward the animals, Mark close behind. Together, they unlatched gates, herding frightened livestock into the field. "Too clean," Mark growled. "This ain't just intimidation anymore. It's war." Eleanor knelt beside the ruin, fingers closing around a twisted bit of metal near the ashes. A kerosene can, still half full. "Judge Hollis," she said through clenched teeth. That night, Mark called a meeting. Not in secret, right out on the front porch. Every hand on the ranch came. Even Sadie, the kitchen girl, stood in the back with her arms crossed and her jaw set. "We don't wait anymore," Mark said. We ride. Tom Bennett stepped forward. Ride where? With what? The sheriff won't back us. Eleanor stood beside Mark. Then we show them we ain't alone. Sadie's voice piped up. You need someone to talk to the railroad men. I've got cousins there. Deke Riley grunted. Ain't never seen a war won with bread and speeches. Mark fixed him with a steady gaze. No, but it starts with standing together. The plan came quick after that. Mark and Deke would ride out by moonlight, scout the judges' line camps, and report where his riders were roosting. Sadie would head to the station, see what ears she could bend. Tom would ride into town again, quiet-like, and bring back supplies under cover. Before they split up, Eleanor pulled Mark aside. You sure you want to do this? She asked. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I've been running from nothing so long. It feels good to run toward something. Then he leaned in, so close she could smell the trail dust on his coat and feel the heat off his skin. Whatever happens, he said, you made me believe again. Eleanor's hand found his. Then let's make em regret ever trying to break us. As they rode out beneath the stars, Mark felt a fire in his chest that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with hope. And somewhere, in the ashes of that barn, the first sparks of something stronger than revenge began to glow. Justice, maybe. Or love. They rode by starlight, keeping to creek beds and gullies, the land whispering beneath their hooves. Mark led, rifle across his back, eyes sharp. Deke followed, quieter than usual, chewing on a matchstick and keeping one hand near his revolver. Hollis's boys are sleeping fat off the land, Mark said. I aim to wake him up. By midnight, they spotted the first campfire, 3 riders, tents pitched in a clearing just off Mule Ridge. Hollis's brand glinted on their saddle flaps. Mark motioned for silence, then crept closer, crawling like a coyote through sagebrush. The riders weren't on watch. One snored. Another dozed with his hat over his face. Mark could smell the whiskey from 20 yards. Sloppy, Deke muttered. Desperate, Mark corrected. They marked the location, backed off, then rode further. Found a second camp near a dry spring. This one tighter, more alert. A man on watch, pacing slow. Still, Mark counted 4 horses. One with a red scarf nodded to the horn. That's our thread, Mark said. Sadie was right. As dawn broke, they returned to Blackthorn with word of the camps and their numbers. Eleanor met them on the porch, coat pulled tight, eyes bright with resolve. You want him gone? Mark asked. We'll need to strike fast. She nodded. Then we do it tonight. All 3 camps. One sweep. No prisoners. Deke asked. Mark looked at Eleanor. Your call. She was quiet a long moment. Then, ward him first. Offer surrender. But if they raise a gun, drop him. The ranch hands armed up. Old rifles were oiled. Sadie handed out cartridges with a solemn expression, and even Tom Bennett strapped on a sidearm he hadn't touched in years. Just before sunset, Eleanor took Mark aside. You're lead in this. He blinked. You sure? I trust you, she said, and that scares me more than anything. Mark touched her hand, rough fingers brushing hers. I won't let you down. She nodded, but her eyes held something else. Fear, hope, maybe even love, though neither dared name it. The riders split into 3 groups, each bound for a different camp. Mark led the push toward Mule Ridge. When they crested the rise, rifles ready, Mark stood tall in the stirrup and shouted, You got one chance. Drop your irons and walk. One rider bolted. Another reached for steel. Mark fired once. The crack echoed like thunder, and the man dropped. The rest threw down their guns. You tell Judge Hollis, Mark said. This land don't bow anymore. By morning, all 3 camps were emptied. Fires doused. Guns taken. Not a life lost where surrender was given. But 2 men weren't so lucky in the southern sweep. Deke's group had faced a fight, and one of their own, young Caleb Rhodes, took a bullet through the shoulder. Eleanor rode out to meet the men as they returned. She saw the wounds, the blood, and said nothing. Just helped Caleb down and carried him inside herself. Later, as Mark stood on the porch again, gun stood still on his sleeves, Eleanor came to his side. They'll come now, she said. "They'll try," Mark answered. And as the sun rose over Blackthorn, the house behind them no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like the heart of a stand. The letter came 3 days later, delivered by a boy no older than 12, shaking in his boots like he'd carried a ghost in his satchel. It was sealed with crimson wax and bore the unmistakable snake-coiled B of Judge Hollis. Eleanor broke the seal at the kitchen table, her fingers steady but her shoulders tight. Mark read over her shoulder. "To the Lady of Blackthorn Range. You've made your position plain. Now I'll make mine. Surrender the east pasture and the creek rights, and I'll consider this finished. Refuse, and the next men I send won't come with tents. They'll come with coffins." Eleanor set the letter down. Mark folded it once, pocketed it. "Time to end this," he said. That night, they gathered the riders in the barn, 12 men and women who'd stayed through fire and fear, and one cowboy who'd come from nothing, but stayed because of something he still couldn't name. "We ride for justice," Eleanor said, her voice strong as iron. "Not vengeance, not pride, but if Hollis wants a war, he'll have to bleed for it." They didn't ride at night. No more shadows, no more secrets. At dawn, they rode straight into town, Eleanor at the front, Mark at her side. The streets of Coyote Bluffs were quiet as the grave, shutters drawn, faces peeking out from behind curtains. At the courthouse steps, Judge Hollis stood in a black coat, flanked by hired guns. 6 in all, maybe more hidden. "Brave of you," he said, sneering. "But foolish." "You're finished," Eleanor replied. "Every rancher within 10 miles knows what you are now." "And what's that?" Mark stepped forward, a coward hiding behind money. Guns were drawn. Time stopped. Then, a single shot cracked the air. One of Hollis's men fell, shoulder torn open. Another stumbled back, struck in the thigh. From the rooftops came shouts. Sadie had gotten through. Railmen, ranchers, townfolk with rifles and old grudges filled the alleys and second-story windows. It was no ambush. It was an uprising. The gunfight was over in under 2 minutes. Hollis, wounded, tried to run, made it halfway down the alley before Deke caught him with the butt of a rifle. They didn't kill him. Eleanor stood over him as he lay in the dust. "This town is free now," she said. "You'll stand trial. And this time, it won't be in your court." When the smoke cleared and the sun rose higher, Mark leaned against the rail outside the saloon, blood drying on his sleeve. Eleanor joined him, quiet. "You all right?" she asked. Mark nodded. "First time in years I feel like I might be." She smiled, tired but warm. "Then maybe it's time to build something new." He looked at her, really looked. "Together?" he asked. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Spring came slow that year. The snow melted in muddy streaks across the prairie, and the grass pushed up cautious and green, like it wasn't sure the sun could be trusted again. But on Blackthorn Range, things were different. The burned barn had been rebuilt, stronger now, wider too. New hands had come from town and neighboring spreads, folks tired of being scared. They came not just for wages, but for a cause. Mark spent his days in the saddle again, but this time the ride felt different. He was no longer drifting through life like a tumbleweed on a bad wind. He had a place, a purpose, a woman. And Eleanor, well, she wasn't the same neither. Gone was the lonely figure behind lace curtains and cold marble halls. Now she rode every morning, walked the grounds every night, sleeves rolled, boots muddy, hair braided back like a schoolgirl with too much work to do. One evening, they sat on the porch together, coffee mugs in hand, stars above like silver nails in the dark. "You ever think you'd settle?" she asked. Mark chuckled low. "Didn't figure I'd live this long." She nudged him with her shoulder. "That's not what I meant." He looked at her. "I never thought a woman like you would look twice at a man like me." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Then you're a fool. A good fool. But still a fool." He laughed, and the sound surprised them both. Then silence again, the kind that ain't awkward, just full of every word they hadn't needed to say. But not everyone was ready to let the dust settle. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived, sealed in wax again, but this time bearing a different crest, a federal stamp. Inside was a summons. Eleanor Blackthorn was to appear in Cheyenne. A claim had been filed against her ownership of Blackthorn Range. The basis: fraud. Signed testimony by one Edgar Hollis from his prison cell. Mark read it twice. "They're still coming," he muttered. Eleanor folded the letter slow. He can't stand to lose. Not even from behind bars. Mark looked at her, jaw set. "We ride to Cheyenne." She hesitated. "You don't have to come." He leaned forward, taking her hand. "I do," he said. "Not 'cause I owe you. Not 'cause I'm trying to be a hero." She looked into his eyes, waiting. "But because I love you. And wherever you're going, I'm already halfway there." Eleanor's lips parted, breath catching in her throat. "You sure about that, Cowboy?" Mark nodded, slow. "I was sure the moment you stepped down those stairs and handed me a rifle instead of a ribbon." She kissed him then, right there on the porch beneath a sky full of stars. And when they pulled apart, both knew the road ahead was still wild and uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't walking it alone. Cheyenne was a city of stone and smoke, where iron rails hummed and lawmen strutted like roosters in Sunday boots. Mark had always felt out of place in places like this. Too many rules, not enough sky. But with Eleanor at his side, he rode straight into town like he belonged. The courthouse was tall and pale, like a church built for men who worshipped ink and loopholes. Inside, it smelled of old wood and cold justice. The judge, a sharp-nosed man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked down from the bench with a face carved in disapproval. "Eleanor Blackthorn," he said, "you've been accused of fraudulent land acquisition and intimidation of a federal witness." Mark stood beside her, silent but solid as bedrock. Eleanor's voice rang clear. "I inherited Blackthorn Range legally through marriage. Every title, every deed is clean. The only fraud in this room is sitting in a prison cell scribbling lies." There was laughter from the gallery, soft, but there. The prosecution brought up their witness, a man in a fine coat with a snake smile. Said he used to work the ledgers for the Blackthorn estate. Claimed Eleanor had backdated documents. Claimed Mark was a hired killer, brought in to force neighbors off their land. Mark didn't flinch, just stared. When it came time for testimony, Eleanor stood alone. "I'm not a perfect woman," she said. "I've made enemies. I've made mistakes. But I didn't lie. I didn't cheat. I built that range back from ashes, and I did it without a man's name to hide behind." She paused, then added, "And if standing up for what's mine is a crime, then go ahead and sentence me now. I'll take the gallows over living quiet in fear." The courtroom was still. Even the judge leaned forward. Then Mark spoke, for the first time. "I'm just a cowboy," he said. "Wasn't raised to speak fancy or argue papers, but I seen good men fall for less than what she's carrying. If there's a crime here, it's letting the snakes wear badges while the strong women get shackled." The judge called for recess. 2 hours passed. Then, "Case dismissed," he declared. "Not enough evidence. And frankly, I believe the wrong person's behind bars." Outside, the wind kicked up, warm and dust-sweet. Mark and Eleanor walked out together, hands entwined. "So what now?" she asked. He looked toward the open land. "Now we go home." And that they did. Back to Blackthorn. Back to the porch and the firelight. Back to fences to mend, calves to brand, and a life to shape day by day. Mark Dawson, once just a poor cowboy with nothing but calluses and quiet, had found his future in the fire of a woman who wouldn't bend. And Eleanor Blackthorn, who'd spent too long behind cold stone and colder stairs, found in him a man worth standing beside. Their story ain't in no history book, but in every gust that rattles the gate, every hoofprint in the dust, and every child born under a wide Wyoming sky, there's a little bit of that fire still burning.